The courthouse buzzed with its usual activity as Kendrick Walker, a seasoned federal prosecutor, stepped out of his car. The South Carolina morning sun glinted off his badge, tucked securely into his briefcase. Today's agenda was deeply personal, contesting an erroneous property tax adjustment on the house his late grandmother had left him. That house, modest but full of cherished memories, had been the anchor of his childhood and a symbol of his family's perseverance. The air was warm but crisp, and Kendrick felt a momentary sense of calm before climbing the courthouse steps. His phone buzzed in his pocket. A text message from a colleague flashed on the screen. Judge Edward Hollis doesn't tolerate tardiness. Kendrick's lips tightened into a thin line. He wasn't late, but the warning lingered in his mind. Inside, the courthouse hummed with the usual blend of nerves and urgency. People shuffled through hallways, clutching documents and murmuring anxiously. Kendrick adjusted his tie as he located the correct courtroom. The walls, painted in drab beige, seemed to absorb the tension from the people inside. He had faced countless courtroom battles in his career, but this felt different. This time, it wasn't about enforcing federal law, but defending his family's legacy. The courtroom was nearly full when Kendrick entered. He slipped into a seat at the back and reviewed his meticulously prepared folder. It contained every piece of evidence needed to prove the property tax adjustment was a mistake. Years of consistent assessments, photos of the house, and letters from the local assessor's office. He glanced at his watch. He was 5 minutes early. At precisely 9 a.m., the bailiff called the room to order. "All rise for Judge Edward Hollis," he announced. The judge entered, his robes flowing and his expression set in stone. Judge Hollis was an imposing figure, tall, with piercing gray eyes and a reputation for his no-nonsense demeanor. As he took his seat, the room settled into a tense silence. Case after case was called. Minor disputes over parking tickets, small claims, and zoning issues dominated the docket. Kendrick listened intently, noting the judge's tone with each litigant. Hollis's approach was curt and efficient, often cutting people off mid-sentence. Finally, Kendrick's name echoed through the room. He gathered his folder, adjusted his tie, and approached the podium. "Kendrick Walker," the judge said, barely glancing up. "You're late." The statement landed like a thunderclap. Kendrick's brow furrowed. "Your Honor, I apologize for any confusion. I arrived at 8:55 and have been reviewing my materials." The judge's gaze sharpened. "Excuses don't excuse tardiness," he snapped. "This court operates on discipline and respect." He reached for his gavel. "You are fined $750 for contempt." A ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom. Kendrick's jaw tightened. Around him, he noted others who had arrived late. A young woman scrolling through her phone and a man who had sauntered in mid-session. Neither had been fined or even reprimanded. "Your Honor," Kendrick began, keeping his voice calm and professional. "I was delayed due to an urgent motion related to a federal human trafficking case. My intention was never to disrespect this court." Judge Hollis's expression hardened further. "This court does not bend its rules for anyone, Mr. Walker. Consider it a lesson in punctuality." Kendrick's fingers tightened around the edges of his folder. He had faced bias before, but this moment felt particularly egregious. As he returned to his seat, the judge moved on to the next case without a second glance. Sitting in the back of the courtroom, Kendrick's mind raced. This wasn't just about a fine or a late arrival. It was about a pattern, one he had seen before, though rarely so blatantly. He opened his notebook and began jotting notes. Today was supposed to be about protecting his grandmother's legacy. Now it was about something much bigger. For the first time in years, Kendrick felt a spark of righteous indignation. This fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. Kendrick took a steadying breath as he stepped forward to present his case. Years of experience as a federal prosecutor had taught him the importance of composure, even in hostile environments. Yet, as he began to lay out his argument, he couldn't shake the feeling that Judge Hollis's interest in the facts was fleeting at best. "Your Honor," Kendrick began, his tone measured, "the property tax adjustment in question reflects a 30% increase. I have here documentation from the city's assessor's office confirming that this adjustment was applied erroneously." He handed a neatly organized folder to the court clerk, who placed it before the judge. Judge Hollis barely glanced at the materials. "I'll review this at my convenience," he said, his voice dripping with disinterest. "But, Mr. Walker, you would do well to remember that this court values timeliness and respect. Perhaps if you'd arrived earlier, this matter wouldn't be so rushed." Kendrick's grip tightened on the podium. "Your Honor, the evidence speaks for itself. The adjustment is baseless and unjust. This house has been in my family for decades, and the previous assessments have been consistent with its value." Hollis held up a hand, silencing him. "We'll see about that," he said curtly. Returning to his seat, Kendrick felt a simmering frustration. The dismissive tone, the lack of consideration for the evidence, and the disproportionate fine for tardiness. It all pointed to something far deeper than a simple case of judicial impatience. Around him, the courtroom hummed with murmurs of discontent, though no one dared to voice their thoughts aloud. As the proceedings continued, Kendrick's trained eye picked up on patterns. A young woman who had slipped in late earlier was now scrolling on her phone, completely ignored by the judge. Another man, dressed in a rumpled blazer, had arrived well after Kendrick, but was allowed to proceed without reprimand. The inequities were glaring. Kendrick pulled out his notebook and began writing. He jotted down the details of each interaction he observed, who the judge reprimanded, who he ignored, and how penalties were distributed. The disparities weren't just frustrating, they were undeniable. When the session adjourned, Kendrick lingered in the hallway, watching the other attendees file out. A middle-aged black man approached him, his expression a mix of frustration and resignation. "You're not the first," the man said quietly. "Judge Hollis, he's got his way of doing things. Folks like us, we don't stand a chance in his courtroom." The words hit Kendrick like a punch to the gut. "Has anyone ever filed a formal complaint?" he asked. The man shook his head. "Most of us don't have the time, the money, or the resources to fight back. And even if we did, who'd listen?" Kendrick's jaw tightened. "I'll listen," he said firmly. That evening, back in his office, Kendrick reviewed his notes. The more he wrote, the clearer the pattern became. Hollis's courtroom wasn't just biased. It was a microcosm of systemic injustice. Minorities and lower-income individuals faced steeper fines, harsher reprimands, and less leniency. Determined, Kendrick began compiling evidence. He requested court transcripts, reviewed public records, and reached out to colleagues who had appeared before Hollis. The stories they shared only fueled his resolve. One attorney described how her client, a young black woman, had been fined $500 for contesting a parking violation, while a white defendant in a similar case received a warning. Another recounted how Hollis routinely interrupted black defendants, refusing to let them fully present their cases. Kendrick knew the path ahead wouldn't be easy. Challenging a sitting judge was no small task, especially one with decades of tenure. But this wasn't just about him or his grandmother's house. It was about standing up for the countless individuals who had been silenced, dismissed, and penalized unjustly. As he pieced together his findings, Kendrick felt a renewed sense of purpose. The fight for justice wasn't new to him, but this time it was personal. This wasn't just about righting a wrong. It was about ensuring that no one else would have to endure what he had experienced. And Kendrick Walker wasn't about to back down. Kendrick Walker sat at his desk, the weight of the day's events still fresh in his mind. The file he had been compiling lay open in front of him, filled with notes, transcripts, and evidence of the systemic bias he had observed in Judge Hollis's courtroom. This was no longer just about a fine or a property tax adjustment. It was about challenging a deeply flawed system. The next morning, Kendrick filed a formal report with the Judicial Review Commission. His submission was thorough, citing specific instances of inequity, backed by data and personal accounts. He described Judge Hollis's disproportionate treatment of black defendants, detailing the stark differences in fines, penalties, and overall demeanor. To Kendrick's surprise, the commission acted swiftly. Within days, a team of investigators was dispatched to review court records spanning the last decade. What they found was staggering. Black defendants were fined, on average, 3 times more than their white counterparts for similar infractions. Requests for leniency or payment plans were consistently denied for minorities, while others received reduced penalties or outright dismissals. The numbers painted a damning picture. one that couldn't be ignored. As word spread, the community began to rally. Local activists, attorneys, and everyday citizens reached out to Kendrick, sharing their own experiences. One young woman, Sarah Franklin, recounted an ordeal that left her in tears. She had been publicly humiliated by Judge Hollis during a hearing over a minor zoning dispute. Despite presenting clear evidence, she was fined $800, while a white defendant with an almost identical case was let off with a warning. A veteran bailiff, James Turner, also stepped forward. Having worked in Judge Hollis's courtroom for over 15 years, Turner admitted he had long been troubled by what he witnessed. "I've seen it too many times," he told investigators. "The way he talks to people, the fines he hands down, it's different depending on who's standing in front of him. I felt powerless to do anything about it. But now, maybe things can change." The revelations were shocking, but they also galvanized the community. News of Kendrick's report quickly gained traction, and social media exploded with hashtags like #JusticeForAll and #EndBiasNow. Stories poured in from others who had faced similar treatment in Hollis's courtroom. Within days, the courthouse steps became the epicenter of protests. Activists held signs reading, "Justice should be blind," and "Accountability for all." Local news outlets picked up the story, and soon, national media began to take notice. Kendrick found himself at the center of a growing movement, his name mentioned alongside calls for sweeping judicial reform. Despite the attention, Kendrick remained focused on the task at hand. He spent long hours working with the investigators, providing them with additional context and ensuring the report's findings were irrefutable. His legal background proved invaluable, allowing him to anticipate potential defenses Judge Hollis might employ and preemptively counter them. Meanwhile, Judge Hollis's courtroom became a pressure cooker. The judge, once seen as an untouchable authority, now faced mounting scrutiny. Hollis publicly denied the allegations, dismissing them as misinterpretations or attempts to smear his reputation. But privately, he was reportedly shaken. Staff members noted his uncharacteristic tension, and whispers circulated about closed-door meetings with his legal counsel. The Judicial Review Commission's investigation deepened. Court clerks, bailiffs, and other employees were interviewed, and additional records were subpoenaed. Among those who came forward was Mrs. Eleanor Harper, a longtime clerk in the courthouse. She produced a hidden notebook she had kept for years, meticulously documenting instances of bias. "I didn't think anyone would ever care," she said, "but I couldn't just sit by and watch." Eleanor's notes, combined with the official records, painted a comprehensive and deeply troubling portrait of Judge Hollis's tenure. Dates, names, fines, and specific instances of mistreatment were all laid bare. Her bravery inspired others, including junior staff members, to come forward with their own accounts. The growing mountain of evidence forced the Judicial Review Commission to act decisively. An emergency hearing was scheduled, and Judge Hollis was summoned to respond to the allegations. The community's eyes were fixed on the proceedings, with many viewing this as a moment of reckoning not just for Hollis, but for a system that had allowed such injustices to persist. For Kendrick, the work extended beyond the courtroom. He met with local advocacy groups, helping them frame policy proposals aimed at preventing future abuses. His efforts inspired a wave of civic engagement, with many citizens calling for increased oversight and transparency in the judiciary. By the time the investigation's findings were made public, the outcry was deafening. Judge Hollis's actions were condemned as systemic misconduct by the commission, which recommended his immediate suspension, pending further disciplinary action. The report also called for broader reforms, including mandatory bias training for judges, regular audits of court decisions, and the creation of independent oversight committees. Kendrick watched the developments with a mixture of satisfaction and determination. The fight was far from over, but this was a significant step toward justice. As he prepared for the next phase, he couldn't help but reflect on how far they had come. What had started as a personal battle had grown into a movement, one that promised to leave a lasting impact on the community and beyond. Kendrick Walker strode into the Greenville Municipal Courthouse, the weight of his badge heavy in his pocket but his resolve unshaken. This was not the federal courtroom where he spent most of his career, but today it felt like the most important case of his life. Clutched in his hand was a folder containing irrefutable evidence, proof that would turn the tide against a system of inequity long left unchecked. The courtroom buzzed with an uneasy energy as Kendrick approached the podium. Judge Edward Hollis sat at the bench, his expression a mask of forced indifference. But Kendrick could see the tension in the way the judge's fingers gripped his gavel. "Your Honor," Kendrick began, his voice clear and steady. "I am Kendrick Walker, Assistant U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of South Carolina. I believe it's important to address the fairness of these proceedings." A hush fell over the room. Kendrick's words carried the weight of his position, but it was the determination in his tone that commanded attention. The spectators, a mix of defendants, attorneys, and curious onlookers, leaned forward in their seats, sensing that something significant was about to unfold. Judge Hollis's eyes narrowed. "Mr. Walker, if you have a matter to discuss, file a motion and schedule an appropriate time. This court does not entertain theatrics." Kendrick met the judge's gaze, unflinching. "This is no theatrical display, Your Honor. It's a matter of justice." He placed the folder on the podium, opening it to reveal a neatly organized set of documents. "Over the past month, I've reviewed years of records from your courtroom. The findings are deeply troubling." The judge's face flushed. "Mr. Walker, this is highly irregular." "Irregular," Kendrick replied, "would be the polite term for what these records reveal. Black defendants in this courtroom are fined, on average, 3 times more than their white counterparts for identical offenses. Requests for leniency are denied disproportionately. Even today, I observed disparities in how tardiness was addressed." Murmurs rippled through the room, the crowd's curiosity giving way to quiet outrage. Judge Hollis slammed his gavel. "This is highly inappropriate, and I will not have my courtroom disrupted." "Disruption," Kendrick countered, "is a symptom of injustice. I have evidence, Your Honor, and I am prepared to present it." Kendrick began outlining the disparities, pointing to specific cases and statistical analyses. He cited the testimony of Eleanor Harper, the court clerk who had meticulously documented years of bias, and James Turner, the veteran bailiff who had witnessed countless injustices. Each point was another stone in the foundation of his argument, one that Judge Hollis couldn't ignore. As Kendrick spoke, the judge's demeanor shifted from defiant to visibly uncomfortable. His gaze darted around the room, noting the reactions of the spectators. Whispers grew louder, and the tension in the courtroom became palpable. "Mr. Walker," Hollis said, his voice cracking slightly, "you are out of line. If you wish to pursue this matter, you may do so through official channels." Kendrick leaned forward slightly, his voice firm. "This is an official channel, Your Honor. As an officer of the court, I am obligated to ensure that justice is upheld, here and everywhere." The judge's gavel came down hard. "I will not allow this court to become a circus. Bailiff, escort Mr. Walker out of the courtroom." Before the bailiff could move, Kendrick stepped back, raising his hands in a gesture of compliance. "I've said what I needed to say here, Your Honor. The rest will be handled by the Judicial Review Commission." The room erupted into hushed conversations as Kendrick gathered his materials and walked toward the exit. Before leaving, he turned back to address the courtroom. "Justice must be blind," he said, "but fairness demands that we confront the truth. I'll see you all again soon." Outside the courthouse, Kendrick was met by a small crowd of reporters and protesters. Microphones were thrust toward him as questions flew from every direction. "Mr. Walker, what do you hope to achieve?" one reporter asked. "Accountability," Kendrick replied. "This isn't just about one judge. It's about ensuring that every person who steps into a courtroom is treated with dignity and fairness." The Judicial Review Commission wasted no time. Within days, they announced a formal inquiry into Judge Hollis's conduct. The evidence Kendrick provided was damning, leaving the judge with little room to maneuver. As public scrutiny intensified, Hollis attempted to defend his record in a series of media statements. But his words rang hollow in the face of overwhelming proof. Weeks later, Judge Hollis announced his resignation, avoiding a public hearing that would have laid bare the extent of his misconduct. His departure was met with a mix of relief and renewed determination among those who had long suffered under his rulings. For Kendrick, the victory was bittersweet. While the resignation marked a significant milestone, it was only the beginning. The fight for systemic reform would take time, and he was prepared to see it through. As he walked away from the courthouse, Kendrick felt a sense of resolve. The system wasn't perfect, but with each step forward, it inched closer to justice. The impact of Kendrick Walker's case rippled far beyond the confines of the Greenville courthouse. What began as a personal fight for justice became the spark for systemic reform across South Carolina. The resignation of Judge Edward Hollis, once considered untouchable, sent a powerful message. No one was above accountability. Municipal courts throughout the state took immediate action. Judicial review boards mandated bias training for all court personnel, from judges to clerks to bailiffs. The training sessions, led by experts in civil rights and equity, focused on identifying and eliminating implicit biases that could influence decision-making. Independent oversight committees were established, composed of legal experts, community leaders, and even former defendants. These committees reviewed judicial decisions, ensuring that sentencing disparities and discriminatory practices were flagged and addressed. For the first time in decades, defendants felt confident that someone was watching, and that fairness might finally become the standard. Regular audits of court records became another crucial reform. Kendrick had proven how powerful data could be in exposing inequities, and the state adopted his methods. Teams of analysts combed through years of sentencing data, uncovering patterns that had gone unnoticed for far too long. The results were stark, but they provided a roadmap for change. Community members who had long felt silenced found their voices in this new era of accountability. Public forums and town hall meetings were organized to hear from those who had experienced discrimination in the legal system. Stories of injustice poured in, heartbreaking accounts of fines, penalties, and rulings that had disproportionately impacted minorities and low-income individuals. Among the voices was Mrs. Eleanor Harper, the veteran court clerk whose detailed notes had been instrumental in exposing Hollis's misconduct. Mrs. Harper became an advocate for ethical practices in the judiciary. She spoke at events and workshops, sharing her story of quietly documenting injustices for years, waiting for a moment when someone would finally listen. Her bravery inspired others to come forward, including James Turner, the bailiff who had worked under Hollis for over a decade. James Turner took his newfound platform seriously. He began leading workshops on fairness and accountability for court staff, emphasizing the importance of treating every individual with dignity and respect. "It's not just about following the rules," he told one group of trainees. "It's about making sure the rules are fair for everyone." Kendrick's influence extended beyond the courtroom. Universities and community organizations invited him to speak about his experience and the broader implications of judicial reform. At one such event, held at a local law school, a young black law student approached him afterward, her eyes brimming with tears. "You've shown me that one person can make a difference," she said. "I want to fight for justice, just like you." Her words stayed with Kendrick, reminding him why this fight mattered. He encouraged her and others like her to pursue their goals, knowing that the next generation of lawyers and advocates would carry the torch forward. In Greenville, the courthouse itself underwent a transformation. The dull beige walls that had absorbed decades of tension and inequity were repainted in brighter, welcoming tones. Signs in multiple languages were installed to guide defendants and visitors through the building. A new help desk provided information on payment plans, legal aid, and procedural guides, resources that had once been elusive. A plaque was mounted near the courthouse entrance, engraved with a simple but profound statement: "Justice belongs to everyone." Inside, systemic reforms were taking root. A new presiding judge was appointed, someone known for their fairness and impartiality. Judge Lila Ramirez, a Latino attorney with a reputation for advocating for underserved communities, quickly gained the respect of court staff and defendants alike. Her presence signaled a fresh start for the courthouse and its mission. Kendrick remained closely involved in the ongoing reforms. He served as an advisor to the oversight committees, sharing his expertise and helping them design protocols to prevent future misconduct. His work extended to mentoring young attorneys, encouraging them to uphold the highest ethical standards. But Kendrick's contributions weren't limited to legal circles. He began teaching a seminar at a nearby law school, focusing on ethics and civil rights in the judiciary. His students, inspired by his story, often stayed after class to ask how they could make a difference. One afternoon, a student approached him with a notebook filled with ideas for reform. "What do you think is the most important thing we can do to make this system fairer?" she asked. Kendrick thought for a moment before responding. Listen. Listen to each other, to the people who come through our courts, and to those who are too afraid to speak up. Listening is where real change begins." The reforms weren't without resistance. Some judges and attorneys bristled at the new oversight measures, claiming they undermined judicial independence. But the data didn't lie. Within a year, the racial disparities in fines and sentences had decreased significantly in Greenville's municipal court. Defendants reported feeling treated with more respect, and payment plans were approved more often. For Kendrick, the most rewarding moments came from the people whose lives had been impacted by the changes. An elderly black man who had been fined heavily under Hollis returned to the courthouse months later to thank Kendrick. "I've been coming here for 40 years, the man said, his voice thick with emotion. "I've seen so much injustice. But now, for the first time, it feels like someone's fighting for us." Kendrick nodded, humbled. The fight wasn't over, but progress was undeniable. Together, the community had turned a moment of injustice into a movement for lasting change. Months later, the Greenville courthouse stood as a testament to transformation. The once intimidating walls now carried a sense of openness and inclusivity. Bright signs in multiple languages directed visitors to resources, ensuring no one felt lost or unwelcome. A newly established help desk offered guidance on everything from payment plans to legal aid. Above all, the centerpiece of the courthouse's new identity was a plaque near the entrance that read, "Equal justice is everyone's right." For Kendrick Walker, walking into the courthouse that day was bittersweet. His framed $750 fine hung on the wall of his office, a constant reminder of how a single act of courage could lead to profound change. The fine wasn't a trophy, but a symbol of perseverance, resilience, and a refusal to accept the status quo. Letters of gratitude poured in from across the country, each one more poignant than the last. One letter in particular struck a chord. Written by a retired attorney in his 80s, it read, "For years, I stayed silent. I saw the same injustices you fought against, but convinced myself I couldn't change the system. Thank you for proving that one voice can make a difference." Kendrick reread those words often, finding both solace and motivation in them. That morning, a crowd gathered for the dedication of the new Judicial Ethics Center, a space designed to promote fairness and accountability in the legal system. It was a culmination of months of effort, collaboration, and community-driven reform. The center was named, fittingly, after Kendrick's late grandmother, Ruth Walker, a woman whose unwavering commitment to justice had shaped her grandson into the man he had become. The ceremony began with speeches from local leaders and community members, each sharing stories of how the reforms had impacted their lives. Then it was Kendrick's turn. As he approached the podium, a hush fell over the crowd. "Justice isn't just about laws," Kendrick began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "It's about people. It's about fairness, dignity, and respect. It's about ensuring that every person who steps into a courtroom feels heard, valued, and treated with humanity." The applause was thunderous, but Kendrick's focus remained on the faces in the crowd. He saw students with notebooks in hand, inspired to follow in his footsteps. He saw families who had once felt powerless, now standing tall with renewed hope. And he saw James Turner and Eleanor Harper, their expressions a mixture of pride and quiet satisfaction. As Kendrick stepped down from the podium, he thought of his grandmother. He could almost hear her voice, urging him to keep pushing forward, to never stop fighting for what was right. Her lessons of integrity and compassion had guided him through every step of this journey. The fight wasn't over, but this moment was proof that progress was possible. The weeks that followed the dedication were filled with more milestones. The Judicial Ethics Center began its work immediately, offering training programs for judges and court staff on implicit bias and ethical decision-making. The oversight committees expanded their reach, ensuring transparency in courts across the state. Reports of racial and socioeconomic disparities in sentencing were steadily decreasing, a testament to the effectiveness of the reforms. Kendrick's own role evolved as well. He became a sought-after speaker, addressing legal conferences, universities, and advocacy groups. At one such event, a young public defender approached him with a determined expression. "Mr. Walker," she said, "I read about your case, and it's the reason I chose this career. I want to be part of the change." Her words resonated deeply with Kendrick. He saw in her the same fire that had driven him to stand up to Judge Hollis, and he knew the movement was in good hands. Beyond the courtroom, Kendrick's story inspired changes in other areas. Community organizations began collaborating with legal professionals to create programs that address the root causes of systemic inequality. Educational initiatives were launched in schools, teaching young people about their rights and the importance of civic engagement. Back in Greenville, the courthouse became a symbol of hope for the community. A mural was commissioned for the lobby, depicting scenes of unity and justice. Among the figures painted on the wall was a likeness of Kendrick, standing tall, his expression resolute. It was an honor he hadn't expected, but one that deeply humbled him. Kendrick's family, too, felt the impact of his work. His wife and children often attended his speeches and events, their pride evident in their smiles. One evening, as he tucked his youngest son into bed, the boy looked up at him with wide eyes. "Dad, are you a superhero?" he asked. Kendrick chuckled, ruffling his son's hair. "No, buddy, just someone trying to make things better." As the months turned into years, Kendrick never lost sight of the mission. The changes he had fought for were significant, but he knew there was always more work to be done. Each victory was a step forward, but the road to true justice was long and winding. On the anniversary of the reform's implementation, Kendrick returned to the courthouse for a quiet moment of reflection. He stood before the plaque near the entrance, running his fingers over the engraved words, "Equal justice is everyone's right." A sense of peace washed over him. The fight had been worth it, not just for him, but for the countless lives that had been changed. Kendrick Walker had set out to challenge a broken system, and in doing so, he had built a legacy of justice that would endure for generations to come.